If you look younger than your age, you might be one of us. If you've never broken a single bone, you might be one of us.
In that conversation, since it happened a few minutes later, but it was good to see nonetheless. The Fed plays a central role in the health of our economy and the stability of our financial system. But with that role comes responsibility to be accountable to the American people, to remain independent from political pressures, and to be transparent. Unfortunately, over the past few years, many Americans have lost confidence in the Federal Reserve. Since 2021, American families have endured persistent inflation, rising interest rates, and a tightening squeeze on their wallets. A college student trying to cover tuition and food with a part-time job is finding that everything costs so much more, while credit costs have doubled. A senior citizen trying to downsize is watching mortgage rates skyrocket and fixed incomes fall behind. Yet during this time of hardship, the Fed has spent billions on lavish renovations to its DC offices. We're talking about rooftop terraces, custom elevators that open into VIP dining rooms, white marble finishes, and even a private art collection. All this costing $2.5 billion, a 32% increase from the original $1.9 billion price tag at a time when the Fed hasn't turned a profit since 2022. We can all agree that updating aging infrastructure is a legitimate need. But when senior citizens can barely afford Formica countertops, it sends the wrong message to spend public money on luxury upgrades that feel more like they belong in the Palace of Versailles than a public institution. At the same time, the Fed's role as an independent, apolitical institution is being questioned. The to green the financial system under the leadership of President Biden, and only to exit it as soon as President Trump took office. That's not neutrality, that's drifting. Now let's turn to supervision at the Fed, which at times is unduly burdensome. The Fed must right-size the regulatory framework for banks to eliminate unnecessary burdens, especially community banks. I'm encouraged that the Fed is taking important first steps on capital, and I look forward to seeing what comes from the board's meetings today on revisions to supplementary leverage ratio standards. But more work needs to be done to ensure capital rules don't choke off access to credit for entrepreneurs and working families. That's why I want to underscore the importance of empowering the newly confirmed Vice Chair of Supervision, Governor Michelle Bowman. Governor Bowman has been a consistent voice for transparency, accountability, and just a plain old-fashioned sanity. I expect her to lead on reform at the Fed, and I expect you as chairman to afford her the same stature as her predecessors. I look forward to hearing from you and your testimony. Ranking Member Warren, you are now recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. When he ran for president, Donald Trump repeatedly promised to lower costs on day one. Those were his words. But since Trump became president, families have been more financially stressed than ever. Since January, consumer sentiment has plummeted. Since January, household debt and delinquencies continue to climb. Since January, workers' worries over layoffs have climbed. Since January, businesses big and small have been paralyzed by uncertainty, and they have hit the brakes on investments and hiring. The cause of these problems has been the chaos caused by one person, President Trump. Chaotic trade policies, massive cuts to families' healthcare coverage to fund tax giveaways to the wealthy, and wholesale deregulation of our financial system that will unleash fraudsters and con men on the middle class. First, trade. Trump continues to play his lose-lose game of red light, green light on tariffs. When this administration slaps tariffs on everything from food to clothing to electronics, working families pay the price. This is bad for the middle class and bad for Main Street. Tariffs like these mean higher prices on essentials for consumers and small businesses, while large corporations and the wealthy find ways to shield themselves from the impact. Second, tax cuts for the wealthy. Trump's one big, beautiful bill that Republicans are jamming through Congress represents one of the largest transfers of wealth from working people to millionaires and billionaires in American history. How are Trump and Republicans paying for part of this $4 trillion in tax giveaways to billionaires? Well, by kicking 16 million people off their health care coverage, cutting food assistance for more than 2 million children, and raising monthly student loan payments for millions of borrowers just after delinquencies have skyrocketed. In addition to raising costs for lower and middle class Americans and taking money right out of their pockets, this bill will also choke economic growth. This isn't tax policy, it's economic warfare against the American people. And even when they throw 16 million people off their health care, the Republicans still can't pay for the lavish tax giveaways to billionaires. So instead of just saying that billionaires and billionaire corporations should just pay a little more in taxes, they put the costs of those billionaire tax cuts on the nation's credit card, the national debt. The Republicans plan to run up the national debt by another $4.2 trillion and expect our children and our grandchildren to pay for it. And finally, deregulation. This administration is systematically dismantling the safeguards that policymakers put in place after the 2008 financial crash to prevent Wall Street from creating another crisis. Less than 2 weeks ago, the Fed board decided to lift Wells Fargo's asset cap. You couldn't even wait until Wells managed to make it one whole year without being caught in a major financial scandal. In just the past 6 months, Wells has been caught and confessed to cheating its customers, cheating its investors, and cheating its workers, the trifecta. For the Fed to give them a gold star and tell Wells it's okay to expand the number of customers, investors, and employees that it can cheat is an outrageous giveaway to one of Wall Street's most derelict banks. And today, you will leave this hearing and go directly to a meeting where the Fed is expected to vote to lower capital requirements for JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and the other too big to fail banks. At a time when the economic data are flashing red, these short-sighted changes will increase the likelihood that these mega banks once again tank the economy and then come back here to beg Congress for bailouts when their risky bets go bust. To sum up Trump's economic agenda, it's chaos and pain for the middle class and even more profits for the powerful. American families will face higher costs and new risks to their health care and their bank accounts. Unemployment will tick up and our economic growth will slow. And that's not just me saying this. It is exactly what the Fed's latest economic projections indicate. I hope my Republican colleagues will wake up to the chaos around us. It falls to Congress to stop Trump's trade war and kill this big, ugly bill. And Chair Powell, it falls to you and the Fed board not to pile additional risk onto Trump's existing chaos by dismantling the safeguards that protect American families from another Wall Street meltdown. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Today we'll hear from the Chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, on the semi-annual.
Have you been sitting on a smart business idea and need to get it online? GoDaddy makes it fast and easy with user-friendly products and tools to help you on your entrepreneurial journey. Plus, get AI to help build your business for you with the all-new GoDaddy Aero experience. Start for free at godaddy.com.
Is at or near maximum employment. Inflation has come down a great deal, but has been running somewhat above our 2% longer run objective, and we are attentive to the risks to both sides of our dual mandate. I will review the current economic situation before turning to monetary policy. Incoming data suggests that the economy remains solid. Following growth of 2.5% last year, GDP was reported to have edged down in the first quarter, reflecting swings in net exports that were driven by businesses bringing in imports ahead of potential tariffs. This unusual swing has complicated GDP measurement. Private domestic final purchases, or PDFP, which excludes net exports, inventory investment, and government spending, grew at a solid 2.5% rate. Within PDFP, growth of consumer spending moderated, while investment in equipment and intangibles rebounded from weakness in the fourth quarter. Surveys of households and businesses, however, report a decline in sentiment over recent months and elevated uncertainty about the economic outlook, largely reflecting trade policy concerns. It remains to be seen how these developments might affect future spending and investment. In the labor market, conditions have remained solid. Payroll job gains averaged a moderate 124,000 per month in the first 5 months of the year. The unemployment rate at 4.2% in May remains low and has stayed in a narrow range for the past year. Wage growth has continued to moderate while still outpacing inflation. Overall, a wide set of indicators suggests that conditions in the labor market are broadly in balance and consistent with maximum employment. The labor market is not a source of significant inflationary pressures. The strong labor market conditions in recent years have helped narrow long-standing disparities in employment and earnings across demographic groups. Inflation has eased significantly from its highs in mid-2022, but remains somewhat elevated relative to our 2% longer-run goal. Estimates based on the Consumer Price Index and other data indicate that total PCE in prices rose 2.3% over the 12 months ending in May, and that, excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 2.6%. Near-term measures of inflation expectations have moved up over recent months, as reflected in both market and survey-based measures. Respondents to surveys of consumers, businesses, and professional forecasters point to tariffs as a driving factor. Beyond the next year or so, however, most measures of longer-term expectations remain consistent with our 2% inflation goal. Our monetary policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. With the labor market at or near maximum employment and inflation remaining somewhat elevated, the Federal Open Market Committee has maintained the target range for the federal funds rate at 4.25% to 4.5% since the beginning of the year. We have also continued to reduce our holdings of Treasury and agency mortgage-backed securities, and beginning in April, further slowed the pace of this decline to facilitate a smooth transition to ample reserve balances. We will continue to determine the appropriate stance of monetary policy based on the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. Policy changes continue to evolve, and their effects on the economy remain uncertain. The effects of tariffs will depend, among other things, on their ultimate level. Expectations of that level, and thus of the related economic effects, reached a peak in April and have since declined. Even so, increases in tariffs this year are likely to push up prices and weigh on economic activity. The effects on inflation could be short-lived, reflecting a one-time shift in the price level. It is also possible that the inflationary effects could instead be more persistent. Avoiding that outcome will depend on the size of the tariff effects, on how long it takes for them to pass through fully into prices, and ultimately on keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. The FOMC's obligation is to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored and to prevent a one-time increase in the price level from becoming an ongoing inflation problem. As we act to meet that obligation, we will balance our maximum employment and price stability mandates, keeping in mind that without price stability, we cannot achieve the long periods of strong labor market conditions that benefit all Americans. For the time being, we are well positioned to wait to learn more about the likely course of the economy before considering any adjustments to our policy rate. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Now I'll be keeping us to a pretty strict 5 minutes, as we have a lot of senators who want to and deserve time with the chair of the Fed. So Senator Rounds, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the courtesy. Chairman Powell, first of all, let me just touch base on, I'm just curious, a couple of items almost of housekeeping nature. With regard to Wells Fargo, was that asset cap and removing it, that was a unanimous vote by all 7 Fed governors, as I recall?
Yes, it was.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciated the chairman bringing up the fact that you have identified reputational risk and have addressed it. I think that was a really important item for the Fed to do, following up on both the OCC and the FDIC's actions. As you know, past Fed materials like the supervision and regulation report often embedded reputational risk within the management component of the CAMELS rating system without clear metrics or accountability. That kind of ambiguity can chill lawful activity and distract from your core mission, monitoring capital, liquidity, and operational resilience. Now that the Fed is moving toward a more objective and disciplined approach to supervision, how will you make sure that this change is fully implemented at the examiner level? And more broadly, what other regulatory updates can we expect?
So on following through on supervision, Vice Chair for Supervision Bowman actually brings an unusual background to this work, and that is that she's a former supervisor. So she speaks that language and relates to their work. And I think if anyone can have an effective relationship with them and work with them successfully, it would be Vice Chair for Supervision Bowman. So I'm confident about that. As we think about things that are going on in the pipeline, so I would just point to a few things. Basel III Endgame. We're going to look at the rating system. We're going to be actually voting to put out for comment something on supplemental leverage ratio this afternoon. We're looking at our merger policy. Stress tests is a big thing, and there are a number of things that we're looking at there that we've announced and we'll be moving to in time.
Thank you, sir. The payment of interest on reserves has become a central pillar of the Fed's post-crisis monetary policy framework. Since the transition away from the pre-2008 scarcity model, where reserves were tightly managed to influence the federal funds rate, the Fed has relied on an ample reserves regime using administered rates like interest on reserves to maintain control over the short-term rates. As of February 2025, nearly 19% of the $18 trillion in bank assets were effectively loans to the Federal Reserve earning interest. Given this structural shift, how feasible would it be for the Fed to return to a scarcity-based framework where reserves earn little or no interest? And if interest on reserves were eliminated, what would be the impact that would have on the Fed's ability to unwind its balance sheet and manage policy rates?
So we're in an ample reserve framework now, and that's a good thing. That's a result of the global financial crisis and the desire to have lots and lots of liquidity and large liquidity requirements for our largest banks in particular. So that's a good thing, and that enables banks to keep lending through stress and that kind of thing. If you were to want to go back to a scarce reserves, it would be a long and bumpy and volatile road. I wouldn't recommend that we undertake that road. It would not save any money. There's an illusion that it would save money. That is not the case. And it would also not make credit more available. This, in effect, I would say having a lot of liquidity in the system, which is what goes with ample reserves, make sure that banks will be able to continue to lend. So we think it works. And I think unwinding it is a policy choice which could be executed, but it would take years to execute and it would be challenging and quite volatile.
Thank you. I've just got about 35 seconds left or so, but I did want to touch on one item that the chairman mentioned it, and I think it's important. I know that you didn't mention it in your opening statement, but would you talk a little bit about just exactly what's going on with your building when you have that type of an overrun on the prices and you're talking about billions of dollars in costs? I think it's appropriate for you to be able to explain to the committee exactly what's going on. Would you take a few minutes, please, and explain what's going on with the value of that building and why the costs seem to be so exorbitant?
I'd be glad to if I can have that time. So
Please.
thank you for the letter we received late yesterday. We will provide a much more detailed response, but just generally, I would just say we do take seriously our responsibility as stewards of the public's money. And the other thing I would start with is no one in office wants to do a major renovation of a historic building during their term in office. You much prefer to leave that to your successors. And this is a great example why, let alone 2 historic buildings that needed a lot of work. But we decided to take it on because honestly, when I was the administrative governor before I came chair, I came to understand how badly the Eccles building really needed a serious renovation. It never had one. It was not really safe and it was not waterproof and that kind of thing. So we took it on. I would also say that the media reports that you accurately quoted, they're misleading and inaccurate in many, many respects. And I would just point to, there's no VPI dining room. There's no new marble. We took down the old marble, we're putting it back up. We'll have to use new marble where some of the old marble broke, but there's no new, there are no special elevators. They're old elevators that have been there. There are no new water features. There's no beehives and there's no roof terrace gardens. Other than that, so all of the sort of inflammatory things that the media carried are either not in the current plan or just inaccurate. So, but notwithstanding that, the cost overruns are what they are. So let me just say on that.
Well, we're well over the 5-minute mark. I'm happy to give you time to talk about that. I'm happy that there are no beehives in there, but we're going to figure out what they are anyways. Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. So Chair Powell, the Fed released its updated economic projections last week, and I appreciate your summary, but I want to look at the trend lines here. The Fed's outlook on inflation, the labor market, and GDP growth have all gotten worse. Compared to your economic projections in December, the latest numbers show that the Fed is now projecting higher inflation from 2.5% in December now to 3.1%. Higher unemployment from 4.3% to 4.5%. Lower economic growth from 2.1% projected just 6 months ago to 1.4% that you're now projecting. Chair Powell, what has changed in the last 6 months that has caused the Fed to forecast substantially higher inflation, somewhat higher unemployment, and lower economic growth than you did in December?
So some of it is just taking signal from data reports that we've seen. Some of it is people working in the possible effects in the short term of tariffs. We have no view on the wisdom or the longer term effects of trade policy. It's not our job. And by the way, I should add, our forecasts are generally, and in this case, are very, very similar to what outside forecasts.
I understand that. I'm just using you as the gold standard here. I know it's consistent, but you mentioned tariffs as one of the things that has changed over the last 6 months. Donald Trump has become president and the economy has headed down. Not only does the Fed data now show slower growth and higher prices this year, it sees slower growth and higher prices over the next 2 years as well. And the Fed sees no longer-term boost to the economy or drop in inflation. In other words, no upside to Trump's chaotic tariff war or his other economic policies. So let's talk for just a minute about what's under the hood of the Fed's economic forecast. Chair Powell, I know a lot of different factors influence the trajectory of interest rates. Is one of those factors how quickly the federal debt grows relative to the growth in the economy?
Not directly, no. We don't look at that as a factor that helps us set monetary policy.
So you're not watching the ratio between the amount of the federal debt and the growth in the economy?
No.
How fast the debt is growing and how fast the economy is growing? I think I have quotes from you saying last year, quote, "We don't need to pay the debt down. We don't need to balance the budget. We just need the economy to grow faster than the debt." Are you saying something different from that now?
No, when asked and pressed, I pretty much always say the same thing as my predecessors, which is that we're on an unsustainable path. I would not say though that I will say this, we do not look at federal financial policy and deficits as something that affects our month to month monetary policy decisions.
I'm trying to get the overall projection of what happens in the economy. So, for example, I think you have made the point that if we spend on things like childcare that can boost labor participation and GDP, that may be a time when you offset the debt that you incur to do that. But if there aren't investments like that, and we are simply running up the debt, what's the impact of increasing the national debt? So I understand that you don't comment on fiscal policy, but it does affect your job, which is keeping inflation under control and also maximizing employment. If certain policies would materially drive up the national debt and increase the debt to GDP ratio over time, could that make it more likely that we would see inflation, all else being equal?
I mean, theoretically, sure, fiscal policy can add to inflation, but that's again, that's really not something we comment on. We try to stay away from fiscal
I understand you don't
policy.
comment on it, but I do appreciate your acknowledgement of the math here. You know, the Joint Committee on Taxation projects the one big beautiful bill would increase federal deficits by $4.2 trillion. According to analysis by the Congressional Budget Office and the Yale Budget Lab, the bill raises the debt to GDP by 24 percentage points. It slows economic growth, it increases inflation, and it reduces real wages. So two of Trump's signature policies, his tariffs and his tax bill, will increase costs for American families. When America borrows money, it should be for investments that Americans need, like investments in childcare or housing or healthcare, that would actually boost economic growth and lower costs. America should not take away healthcare from millions of people who need it and then borrow trillions of dollars just so that a handful of billionaires and giant corporations can get even richer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, ma'am. Chair, banks are facing a record number of regulations. Small community banks are especially burdened by compliance costs. Bank capital requirements should also be appropriately calibrated so banks are not forced to park capital on the sidelines, limiting access to capital for Americans and small businesses. I was pleased to see that the Fed is looking to reform the supplementary leverage ratio. The SLR is supposed to act as a backstop to risk-based capital requirements, but too often the SLR acts as a binding requirement for U.S. banks. Would you agree that adjusting the SLR would free up capital for banks to invest more in treasury markets and other low-risk assets that would be beneficial to families and businesses across the country?
I would agree, yes.
Do you agree with so Vice Chair Supervision Bowman recently acknowledged that regulators tend to review individual elements of the capital framework in isolation without considering whether proposed changes are sensible in the aggregate and contribute to a capital framework which all components work together effectively? Do you agree with her assessment, and how are you looking at the capital framework holistically to ensure that the Fed is not stifling economic growth?
Well, we're looking at basically the two big pieces now are Basel III and the leverage ratio. And I'm pretty confident we'll move on both of those in the relatively near future. And they fit together, as we discussed. The leverage ratio was always supposed to be a backstop rather than the binding. We want risk-based capital to be the binding capital requirement. So that's how those two pieces work together.
And as you look at I hope a reintroduction of Basel III, if you're thinking about the bones of Basel III, obviously over the last several years, we talked about this on Monday. We've heard the comment that the capital requirement was about right, although that capital requirement has been going up every year. And so as you look at Basel III coming back and hopefully being reintroduced and not just recalibrated, what do you forecast?
Well, we very much look forward to working with our colleagues at the OCC and the FDIC on Basel III Endgame. And I would agree we're gonna take a fresh start at that. You know, the last proposal was actually well above Basel minimums. That's the thing. It was the ways in which it was gold plated, as we say. rather than their Basel requirements, which were very significantly exceeded.
Just giving us an opportunity to go back to the spending at the Fed for the construction, and you said that the items that were listed are not happening. I will say that the National Capital Planning Commission website, ncpc.gov, anyone can take a look at it for themselves, not just looking or listening to the New York Post, not just the Wall Street Journal, but page 129 of the final plans reflected rooftop garden terraces. The page 127 and 129 were where we found the ornate water features and final plans. The new elevators that drop board members off at the VIP dining suite was page 37 of the final plans. The white marble was pages 40, 41, 65 of the final plans. I would welcome your staff coming in to walk my staff through what is happening there, as opposed to what we not have only read in the New York Post, not only in the Wall Street Journal, but also at the National Capital Planning Commission's website. So we would welcome that opportunity to have a.
Can I just quickly say, some of those are just flatly misleading. The idea of elevators, it's the same elevator. It's been there since the building was built. So that's a mischaracterization. And some of those are no longer in the plans. That's earlier. The plans have continued to evolve.
That was one of the questions I asked my staff before having the conversation with you in preparation, and assuming that your response would be to refute some of the things that were happening, was to ask the question, well, since the articles came out in April, have the plans changed since April as a result of the media attention to it, or was that just never in the plan? I would just say that having a clear understanding of what's going to be and when it changed would be helpful for us. I will note that having confidence in what we hear is incredibly important. And I would give you the opportunity to bring your team in and or send your team over so that we can have that conversation. That would be helpful.
Look forward to doing that. And if you'll allow me to say one more sentence, none of those things were the cost drivers. The real thing is what were the cost drivers that caused the spending to increase? And we have those too, but those are not the things that did that.
Well, I don't want to
look forward to the conversation.
I don't want to eat into Bernie Moreno's time because he's kind of cranky when I do. I would just suggest that when I hear that things are completely and wholly inaccurate, and then I hear that they weren't quite the way they were, those are two very different framings of the conversation. And I only read page 129, 127 through 129, page 37, page 40, 41, page 65, page 129, because I could be wrong without any question, but I don't want to be misled. That's different. Next would be Senator Reed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Powell. Many times you've been asked about the status of Fed independence from the president, his constant harangues about interest rate policy, et cetera. But over the past year, we've also seen judicial case, which dramatically eliminated the deference to agency decision-making, also extended the statute of limitations on the Administrative Procedure Act. And there is a strong sense that they're about to overturn Humphrey's executor case, which will eliminate the independence of practically all agencies. What's your judgment on the cumulative effect of these judicial actions with respect to the Federal Reserve's ability to do its job?
I mean, the net effect of all of those will be to make courts substantially less deferential to agency decisions. And so that's just the new world we live in. We'll continue to do our jobs, and obviously we'll respect the law as it is. That is the way that the law has been evolving, though.
But there is increasing pressure on the independence from the White House. And do you believe that if Humphrey's executor case is decided in a way that gives the White House more additional authority, that'll be invoked against the Federal Reserve?
I'd rather not speculate, if I may, Senator.
That's quite all right. The U.S. dollar I remember when the phrase was "sound as a dollar." That phrase is getting less used these days. Uh, in fact, Bloomberg reported last week that foreign companies are demanding to be paid not in U.S. dollars but in euros or Chinese renminbi. Um, First, what benefits does a strong dollar have for us, and um, how will we suffer if the dollar is no longer considered to be the currency of world record?
So there are enormous benefits to having the dollar be the most important reserve currency in the world. It remains such, and for very long standing and continuing reasons, which is, our rule of law, our democratic institutions, our commitment to price stability, our open capital markets. All of those things remain intact. And I think being the reserve currency doesn't last forever, but it's quite a durable equilibrium. And I suspect that we will be the world's reserve currency for a long time to come.
But you're seeing indications that confidence in our currency is eroding in some places. Is that
I wouldn't say that. I think it's this is a very fundamental kind of foundational aspect of the global financial system, is the role of the dollar. And markets move around. Markets are digesting information that's sometimes very challenging to digest. I'd be very reluctant to come to any longer run conclusions about things that fundamental this quickly.
Well, I would suggest, and I know you'll keep your eye on it going forward. One of the things you've made very clear is that income inequality and lower rates of upward economic mobility are two of our biggest challenges. And you've also indicated that this is probably beyond the ambit of the Fed in terms of dealing with this. These are more legislative issues. And I would concur. So I was disheartened to read a report from the Congressional Budget Office, which is an independent agency, that the recently House-passed reconciliation bill will take approximately $1,600 per year from the lowest income Americans and give approximately $12,000 to the wealthiest Americans. That seems to be directly contradictory to a society who's committed to raising the income and opportunities and increasing upward mobility. Do you think that's a fair estimate?
I don't know, and I'd be very reluctant to comment on the reconciliation bill, even indirectly.
Well, your wisdom and sagacity has preserved you, and I hope it continues to do so. I must commend you finally. By 2 or 3 years ago, everyone around here was predicting or guessing how deep the recession would be. And because of your leadership at the Fed and other policies, we've avoided a recession. In fact, until recently, we've been growing faster than every other economy in the year, and you deserve credit for that. Thank you.
Just to reiterate my opening comments for those who may not have been here when I made the comments, that Chair Powell has a hard out today. Therefore, I'm going to do my best to keep us at 5 minutes. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, did I understand you to say that the reconciliation bill is the most extraordinary legislation you've ever seen? Did I hear that correctly?
There may have been some lost in translation there.
I was a little late. Tell me what tell me what the bond market's telling you.
Bond market's fine now, functioning well. It's pricing, it's reacting to economic news. There's adequate liquidity. Rates have come down pretty significantly from where they were a couple months ago. So I think I think inflation expectations have come down a bit from April, and in general, the bond market is functioning well.
Okay. Explain to me why we have seen in the last few months a weakness in the dollar.
The job is responsible for the role of the dollar. So I don't know. I think I would go back to the thought that markets have been digesting an unusually challenging set of circumstances, and have reacted the way they've reacted. The dollar's kind of stabilized now. In fact, it's moved back up here in the last couple of weeks a bit. And there are plenty of people who are still writing that the dollar is still overvalued. We don't have a view on that, of course, but I wouldn't really have an opinion on exactly why it is where it is.
Well, clearly there's a lot of geopolitical risk right now, which would lead one to conclude, all things being equal, that people would be flocking to the dollar and it would be stronger.
Well, you have seen some of that here in the last few days, but again, I don't really have an official view I'd like to share on that. I think there are possible explanations, multiple possible explanations. Again, one of which is that some people still feel the dollar is highly valued.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
I want to talk for a few minutes about tariffs and inflation. What does history tell us about tariffs and its impact on inflation or deflation?
So the thing is, we've been through a long period in which tariffs were going down. Remember, since World War II, really, it's been a process of lowering tariffs globally. So there just isn't a lot of modern learning on that. I think people look at the incidence of tariffs during the president's first term, but those were like 1/6 the size of what's people are estimating now. And they do find some effects on inflation. But remember, in 2019, when those tariffs were put into place, the economy was slowing. We actually cut rates 3 times. Inflation was running at 1.5%. So it was a very different time. This is different. I think one of the reasons why it's so challenging is that there really isn't a modern precedent.
Yeah.
And I think we have to be humble about our estimates. And we are very open to the possibility that transmission through into inflation will be less than we think, or maybe more than we think, which is why we're in a position of wanting to take our time and make a smart decision as we see how this unfolds.
Well, obviously the size of the tariffs makes a difference, does it not?
It does.
And we don't know yet the
We don't.
size of the tariffs.
We don't. And we don't have a view on any of the merits at all. That's not our job. Our job is inflation, as you know, and maximum employment.
Will it also matter? Let's assume that there is upward price pressure. Would it matter how much businesses decide to pass on versus just eat? Does that make sense?
Yes, that matters. That is what matters. The question is, who's going to pay for the tariffs? Originally, it's the importer, but it gets passed along through the distribution chain to some extent to the consumer. The ultimate question of it is how much of it does show up in inflation. And honestly, it's very hard to predict that in advance. So we're watching to see, what shows up in measured inflation.
If the president's trade negotiators pursue reciprocity, which I define as both sides reducing, in a quid pro quo, reducing tariffs and trade barriers as much as possible. Ideally, in a perfect world, we would end up with 2 sides with 0 tariffs and 0 trade barriers. Would that be inflationary?
No, not at all.
That would cause the economy to roar, wouldn't it?
I think it would be.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your endorsement, Mr. Chairman, of the reconciliation bill.
Senator Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Funny, Senator Kennedy, I didn't interpret his comments that same way.
I
would also say that, one, thank you, and we echo what Senator Reed said. Thank you for your independence and doing the job. End of the day, I think tariffs are a tax, and they're going to hit. They're going to hit, I think, starting next quarter. And again, I think the reciprocity argument, that would be a nice goal. I guess I hope we can then explain to the Australians, who are a strong ally of us, who we have a free trade agreement, so we don't have tariffs, who we have a trade surplus with, who I'm hoping we're going to be able to build jointly submarines, why they, with all those things, still got whacked with a 10% tariff. doesn't seem rational or logical to me. But let me get to, I've been very concerned about some of the Trump administration's, I think, mismanagement of the federal workforce. I can tell you some of the DOGE approach in the national security and intel world. Cuts are having dramatic effects. But today I want to mention something that frankly doesn't get a lot of attention, a very small entity, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. U.S. economic data, which has always been independent, it's really been viewed as the gold standard across the globe. And frankly, the BLS data often is the guidepost that investors use regularly. BLS helps us get information about cost of living increases, policymaking for you guys. It's used to adjust payments on the roughly $2 trillion in Treasury bonds. The truth is that the BLS data shouldn't be degraded on any basis. Yet, the administration is so dramatically, and I hope my Republican colleagues will hear on this, cut back the staffing at BLS, that the BLS has had to significantly cut back on the collection of critical price and inflation data. Normally, BLS staff, when you don't have all the data collected, will estimate about 10% of the inputs into the CPI. Now, with these cutbacks, they've had to estimate close to 30% of the data. That means faultier data. How can we grapple with this, and what does the undermining and staffing shortages at a BLS mean in terms of your ability at the Fed to do your job?
You know, we can still do our job. I would not want anyone to think that the data have deteriorated to a point where it's difficult for us to understand the economy as well as we can understand it, which is not perfectly. But the direction of travel is concerning. You know, the U.S. has been a leader globally in investing in how to measure the output of a modern economy, which is something that we've led the world in for a long time. And it really helps not just policymakers, but also businesses. If we have accurate information about what's going on in the economy, you're making decisions based on that economy, not just the Fed, not just you, but private companies as well. So I think it's I think it's something we should continue to invest in. And I don't like to see any deterioration in the public data, which has been the gold standard. The BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and others have really been the bedrock that people really do look to as solid data that tell us what's
And these
happening
people
in the economy.
who do collect this input, who do some of this analysis, they are experts. They are not fungible. You fired one and hire another. I mean, there's an expertise here that has been, I think, being undermined. And again, you just look at the fact that if you have to do your estimates, move it from about 10% estimate to a 30% estimate, that is not good for the markets. Let me move to one other topic in my last minute. Stress tests, really important. Those of us who are involved in Dodd-Frank, really important as we try to particularly think about the most significant banks. But there has been concern, I've shared some of this concern, that the stress test process was so opaque that while the regulators may fully have understood, sometimes the very banks being regulated didn't understand fully the criteria. I know you're taking a look at how we can bring more transparency to the process. When do you think we'll see that, and what kind of changes do you think we'll make?
Well, later this year, we've said that we're going to, fully disclose the models. And, that's the main thing. If you're going to set, it's like the IRS, if you're going to charge people taxes, you have to have the transparency about what that is. It's going to be the same as that. We're going to show how the calculations are made. And we're working on all that right now. We're also we have a proposal out to sort of smooth the results of the test from year to year. So this is something we're working on hard and expect to have important progress later this year when we begin to publish the models.
I'm anxious to see it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Ricketts. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we were talking about tariffs a little bit earlier, the senator from Virginia talked about Australia. I will point out that Australia has, we bought about $28 billion worth of Australian beef, and they've bought exactly 0 of ours. So there's an opportunity to be able to improve that trade relationship. So that's one of the things I hope will come out of the trade negotiations.
You will acknowledge there is, though, we actually have a trade
We actually have a
surplus.
trade surplus with Australia. That is correct, but we'd like to sell more beef to them. So that's an opportunity. But one quick question on that, kind of just following up on Senator Kennedy's line of questioning. So if a tariff was put in place and the prices went up, wouldn't that be a one-time event, right? Because after that, it would be baked in. It's just a one-time thing.
So it might well be, as I indicated in my opening remarks, it might well be a one-time event, but that isn't a law of nature. You know, we would want to make sure of that. We were more sure of that back in 2018 because we'd had, 40 years of low inflation. Coming off of a global inflation episode where we haven't fully returned to 2%, it's something it's a question we will approach carefully.
But if the tariff is only put in once and just maintains the flat rate there, then how could that be inflationary in the second year?
Well, because it could be a process of many years. I mean, that's a couple of things. One is if it comes in quickly and it's over and done, then yes, very likely it's a one-time thing, like an oil shock, a one-time oil shock where the price comes back down, it goes through the system. It doesn't raise inflation, just raises prices once. But if you have a process that goes on multiple shocks for years, for example, or if the shocks are very large, that kind of thing. And I think, again, we have to be conscious of the current situation, which is people haven't seen 2% flat inflation for some years now. And it's different from what it was in 2018 when we had tariffs earlier, when we actually cut rates.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying we're not reacting at all of this. It's a risk we feel like as the people who are supposed to keep stable prices for the benefit of the American people, we need to manage that risk too. That's all we're doing. We're not deciding what to do yet.
So if Senator Warner's comment that a tariff is a tax, would that imply that then taxes could be inflationary as well?
No.
So what's the difference between a tax and a tariff then? Or do you disagree with Senator Warner's characterization that tariffs are not taxes?
I wouldn't disagree with that, but it's not the language I use. As I say, one time could be the base case, but in a situation like this where the process could go on for a long time, where the effects could be large or small, it's just something you want to approach carefully in a world where inflation is not back to 2%. And that's our job. If we make a mistake here, people will pay the cost for a long time. And so we're just approaching the question carefully. That's all we're doing. You know that, a majority of my committee has said that they do expect to cut rates between now and the end of the year in the remaining 4 meetings. So it's not that we're, taking a strong view that it will be inflation and not a one-time cost increase. It's just that we're going to take a careful approach to that very critical question.
Well, let me switch gears on you a little bit. Communist China is our single greatest threat to America's national security and financial independence. Now more than ever, the U.S. must ensure security of our financial system against Communist China's malign influence. And in 2022, Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee released a report identifying efforts by Communist China operatives to infiltrate the Federal Reserve System. The report contained real-life examples of Communist China's attempts and tactics used to target Federal Reserve officials. In late January, a former senior advisor to the Fed Reserve was arrested on charges that he conspired to steal Federal Reserve trade secrets to benefit and advance Communist China's interests. This Wall Street Journal article from May 2025 details the potential ramifications of his actions. The kind of data and trade secrets that this Fed Reserve employee shared could allow Communist China to manipulate the U.S. market and gain advanced knowledge of changes to the federal funds rate. It could provide Communist China with an advantage when selling or buying U.S. bonds and securities. Chairman, has the Fed Reserve made any changes to strengthen its internal counterintelligence and security protocols since the development of these incidents?
So that's an incident, and I would say we take it very seriously. We have quite elaborate and serious and strict provisions around staff access to information, serious protections for confidential information. We have background checks. We have annual training. We have many of those things. I don't know that we've made any fundamental changes, but we're certainly, very sorry to see something like this having taken place. We haven't.
Great. Well, heart out, so I'll go ahead.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Powell. Good to see you. I want to start by acknowledging the continued uptake of the FedNow real payment system. I know I've raised the rollout of that system with you in many, many hearings over many years. We're now about 2 years after launch. I want to continue to work with you and your colleagues to encourage expanded adoption of the capability and capacity so that customers have real-time access to their money. So I just ask that we continue to work on that together. You agree?
I do.
I thought you might. Thank you. So I want to ask you about the student loan situation in the country. And you've talked about this in the past, and you've talked about how it can be a drag on the economy, especially when it gets to be very high in terms of balances that cannot be paid. According to the New York Fed, student loan balances grew by $16 billion to reach $1.63 trillion in the first quarter of this year. Data shows an uptick in the student loan delinquency rate overall, the age of delinquent borrowers, and the number of newly delinquent borrowers. Department of Education, meanwhile, restarted debt collection activities last month. And starting in July, nearly 2 million borrowers could see their wages being garnished. Meanwhile, here in the Senate, President Trump and Republican senators are working to pass this piece of legislation that would limit affordable loan repayment options and make it harder for borrowers to responsibly repay their debt and get back on a path toward financial health. So, Mr. Chairman, you said before in your testimonies that student loan debt can negatively impact borrowers' ability to fully participate in our economy, and that it can weigh down on the economy overall. Is that still your view?
Yes, it is.
And could you just share your assessment from a factual perspective about how this problem seems to be growing at this point in time, and what would happen if we allow all of these borrowers to default?
So the point I was making, I try hard not to comment on things that aren't Fed policy, but I broke that rule in this case many years ago. And so I'll just say what I said then, which is, you can make all kinds of investments and you can discharge.
Türk voleybolunda görmeye alışık olduğumuz hareketler. Mesela manşetlerde yer almak. El ele verip yarınlara ilham olmak. Tarihe bir hikaye bırakmak. Gururumuzu 85 milyon bir arada yaşamak. Voleybol milli takımlar ana sponsoru Trendyol, Milletler Ligi'nde milli takımımızın yanında.
I could not agree with you more about the anomaly in the ability to discharge a debt in bankruptcy. The idea that student loan sort of is the one category of debt that we don't allow to be discharged is confounding. I think, unfortunately, so far, it's been a sign of the power of some of the companies involved in that area. And I just came from another committee where I'm the ranking member, so I apologize if you already talked about the tariff situation. But I know this was obviously a factor that you all had to consider in making decisions about changes in the interest rates. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty in the economy. I mean, I hear it every day from Marylanders. We have the Port of Baltimore. We have lots of small businesses that rely on tariffs. You're an economist. You know that increasing tariffs is like increasing taxes across the board. But can you just speak to the uncertainty component of all of this and how that is weighing on people's decisions?
So surveys show very widely that people feel uncertain about the economy, and they do point to tariffs in that answer. I will say, though, that actually peaked back in April and has come down a little bit. And if you talk to businesses, I talked to an unusually large number of business people in the last couple of months, and the feeling is a little better now than it was. They're getting on with it and feeling, I'd say surveys are still showing depressed sentiment, but it's moved up from where it was.
I would say, Mr. Chairman, that may be the case at this moment, but we all know that we could wake up any morning and see another tweet, and that could change dramatically. So I appreciate your efforts to try to do what you can to meet your dual objectives at the Fed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Senator Lummis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Chairman Powell, for being here today. As you know, what always vexes me and has for the last 4.5 years about the Federal Reserve is the bank supervision function as opposed to the monetary policy function. So I'm going to focus on bank supervision. First of all, I do want to thank you and Vice Chair Mickey Bowman for ensuring reputation risk has been removed from the bank supervision process. It was very arbitrarily used by those who were supervising. On January 27th, 2023, I'd call it the high watermark for Operation Choke Point 2.0. The Federal Reserve Board, in coordination with President Biden's White House, executed a coordinated attack to isolate the digital asset industry from the banking system. And while the Fed has taken steps to adopt a more balanced approach to digital assets, which I appreciate, the legacy of January 27th, 2023 remains with us today. So I'd like you to look at this quote. It says, issuing tokens on open, public, and/or decentralized networks or similar systems is highly likely to be inconsistent with safe and sound banking practices. So my first question is, do you recognize this quote?
Yes, not super clearly, but yes, I do.
Because it's from the Federal Reserve Board's policy statement on Section 913 of the Federal Reserve Act, which was formally adopted by the board on January 27th, 23. So now, Chairman Powell, I want to show you another statement, and I'm sorry if you can't see it clearly, I'll read it to you. It's from the Genius Act, which just passed the Senate by a vote of 68 to 30 last week. And it takes the opposite position to the board's policy statement on issuing stable coins on an open, public, distributed ledger. So my question is, what has changed about the risk of stable coins since the board adopted its policy in 2023? And now that the Congress has weighed in, at least the Senate has weighed in and sent the Genius Act to the House, does the board plan to withdraw the policy statement on Section 913?
So what I think what has changed is, you go back, that's a couple of years ago, that was the period of high profile failures and fraud and that kind of thing. And what's happened is, I think, the industry is maturing, our understanding of it is improving, and in a sense, it's becoming much more mainstream. So all of us are revisiting, the things that were that era. And, I think the current view is that it's appropriate. It's always been appropriate to undertake activities as long as they're safe and sound. In terms of, I think I have to get back to you on 13. I think it's a broader thing that has nothing to do with crypto, but we are with